The palace slept, its stone corridors swallowed by pre-dawn shadow. Candles flickered along the grand hall, their golden light brushing against centuries of tapestries and polished marble. The silence was not peace. It was anticipation, a quiet charge with expectation. Somewhere beyond the echoing gates, footsteps whispered discipline, a reminder that every motion within these walls was measured, observed, controlled. Charlotte sat alone, perched at the edge of her bed, staring at a door that should have opened, a bell that should have sounded, and feeling the sharp sting of neglect. For years, she had moved like a ghost through the palace, overlooked, underestimated, confined by ritual and by authority she did not respect. And yet, within her, a spark had been growing, a restless pulse that refused to bend. Across the halls, Camilla prepared with meticulous precision, adjusting robes, aligning candles, checking ceremonial scripts. Power flowed from her every movement. Yet even she was unaware of the fissures that ran beneath her command. It was in these quiet, fragile moments that rebellion first whispered. A misaligned parchment, a trembling hand, a minor breach in protocol, all unnoticed by the untrained eye, all recorded by Charlotte's. And in that observation, a plan began to take shape, a subtle defiance that could change everything. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of authority still lingered, like a shadow cast over polished marble. Before dawn, the palace breathed in measured quiet, each arch and corridor holding centuries of discipline. Even the guards moved as though part of the walls themselves, silent, precise, unyielding. Above, in a narrow corridor, Charlotte lingered, perched on the edge of her bed, staring at the locked door across the hall. It was a minor barrier, yet in that moment, it felt like the weight of every protocol she had endured, every slight unnoticed, every presence dismissed. Camilla moved with deliberate grace through the east wing, her heels clicking against polished floors, echoing authority. Each movement was ritual, each glance a statement of control. She adjusted the folds of her ceremonial robes, eyes scanning for imperfections in the meticulous alignment of candles, scrolls, and ceremonial instruments. The bell that should have rung remained silent, a minor disruption that gnawed at her composure. Her world was one of order, and even the faintest deviation unsettled the foundation she had so carefully built. Charlotte's fingers brushed the cold doorframe. She felt the simmering frustration, a long-suppressed desire for recognition and autonomy. A locked door, a silence bell, an overlooked presence. They were small, almost imperceptible cracks, but to Charlotte, they signaled possibility. The palace, magnificent and imposing, was not invincible. Through the hallways, tapestry stretched floor to ceiling, chronicling battles, treaties, and the reigns of long-dead monarchs. The stories woven into silk and thread reminded Charlotte that tradition had weight, but weight alone could not bind a mind determined to see what others could not. She observed every flicker of shadow, every misaligned ceremonial sword, cataloging errors invisible to those who walk blindly in routine. Camilla paused in the mirrored alcove, adjusting her posture with precision honed over decades. Yet even she betrayed a subtle tremor in her wrist, a human flaw in an otherwise mechanical rhythm. Charlotte noted it quietly, as if the palace itself had whispered a secret. The walls that imposed order also revealed weakness. She only had to see it. The guard steps echoed through corridors like a metronome of discipline. Each click of boot against marble reaffirmed the centuries of obedience expected within these walls. Yet Charlotte glimpsed a silent understanding in a junior aide's eyes, a spark of empathy that recognized courage, patience, and intelligence. The palace was not simply stone and ritual. It was a theater of power, and Charlotte intended to play a role not prescribed by tradition. Hours passed as she traced Camilla's morning route, noting every guard, every bell, every tilt of ceremonial robes. She cataloged timing and motion, mapping the palace with precision. Each observation strengthened her understanding of the hierarchy, revealing gaps in Camilla's meticulous order. A tilt of a sword, a misplaced candle, a smudge on parchment. Each became a silent map of opportunity. Camilla, oblivious to the scrutiny, continued her ritual. Candles were lit in exact alignment, the soft scent of beeswax mingling with polished stone. Scrolls were unrolled and checked, ceremonial scripts memorized, commands rehearsed. The discipline was absolute, yet Charlotte perceived imperfection in the micro details, a flicker of hesitation, the faint tremor of authority, human vulnerability masked beneath layers of control. Charlotte's gaze fell on a misaligned document, letters slightly askew, ink faintly smudged. To most, it was insignificant. To her, it was a signal, a crack in the edifice of power. She bent closer, inhaling the quiet tension of the palace, understanding that even the most disciplined could err. Observation was power, and power, when timed and measured, could challenge authority without breaking ritual. Camilla's voice broke the stillness, soft and commanding. All preparations must proceed without deviation. The words hung in the candlelit hall, like an invisible line drawn across centuries of tradition. And yet, Charlotte noticed a subtle hesitation, the faint shadow of uncertainty beneath perfect composure. Even absolute authority was not infallible. Charlotte retreated to the shadows of her room, her mind cataloging every detail, every motion, every minor imperfection. The palace was a living map, each corridor a potential strategy, each ritual a hidden opportunity. By the time sunlight brushed the gates, she had made a silent promise, outwardly compliant, inwardly calculating. She would test the limits of obedience. Her gaze returned to the mislaid document, the ink still faintly wet. It symbolized imperfection, the first tangible sign that even discipline could be challenged. The palace's walls whispered secrets to those willing to observe, and Charlotte was listening. Patience, precision, and subtle defiance had become her weapons. The palace itself would reveal the stage for her first act of rebellion. Charlotte's eyes lingered on the misaligned parchment, recognizing a secret in Camilla's control, a vulnerability that would soon demand attention. The morning sun filtered through the palace windows, painting long lines across the marble floors. Shadows stretched from gilded pillars, and the corridors seemed longer, heavier, as though the weight of history pressed on the present. Charlotte moved quietly, her footsteps absorbed by thick rugs that muted sound, allowing her to navigate the palace unseen. Each corridor, each archway, each polished surface became a library of human behavior, waiting to be read. She had begun cataloging not only the imperfections in Camilla's routine, but the subtle inconsistencies hidden within the palace's protocol. Camilla was already immersed in ceremonial preparation. Her robes fell in perfect folds, each candle aligned with absolute precision. Scrolls were examined multiple times, ceremonial orders recited aloud, each phrase perfected. To an outsider, the process was flawless. But Charlotte, attuned to nuance, noticed the small anomalies. A misplaced key on a gilded hook, a letter slightly out of order on Camilla's desk, a ceremonial sword leaning an inch too far to the left. Each was a detail overlooked, a crack in the structure of authority. Charlotte's study of the palace extended beyond Camilla herself. She observed the guards, trained for decades, moving with military exactitude, yet revealing subtle signs of fatigue and frustration. One guard paused a fraction too long at a door. Another shifted weight between boots in a rhythm not dictated by protocol. Aides whispered quietly in corners, their conversations carefully muted. Yet Charlotte noted cadence and tone, cataloging alliances and subtle undercurrents. The palace was alive with communication that could never be seen from the outside, each gesture a language of power, loyalty, and hidden tension. In the grand library, Charlotte traced her fingers along the spines of volumes chronicling past monarchs and ceremonial practices. Each book was a lesson in order, yet gaps in archival notation hinted at flexibility, at discretion once permitted but now forbidden. She found a record of forgotten ceremonies, annotations scribbled by aides long dead, marking exceptions that allowed adaptation within ritual. These were precedents that undermined the rigidity Camilla presented as absolute. Charlotte understood that history itself could justify cautious defiance, and she memorized every detail. The corridors whispered as she passed, each tapestry a story frozen in silk and thread. Battles won, alliances forged, betrayals recorded silently for the observant eye. Charlotte used them as mirrors, noting patterns in posture, in positioning of guards, in ceremonial movements repeated for generations. She began to map these patterns, drawing connections between the rigid expectation of loyalty and the subtle fractures where human error had crept in. The palace was a system built on discipline, Yet Charlotte saw opportunity in observation. Late morning brought her to a lesser-used wing, where the air was cooler and dust motes floated like drifting spirits in sunlight. Here, she uncovered her first real anomaly, a set of keys, gold-plated, hanging slightly askew on a hook behind a closed door. One key was smaller than the others, its purpose unclear. Charlotte studied it, noting the wear on the metal, the faint scratches along its edge. A door that should never been unlocked might indeed conceal information. Access granted once, perhaps, and then forgotten. She cataloged the detail, understanding its potential leverage in the subtle contest of authority that was quietly taking shape. The palace staff, oblivious to her scrutiny, moved in orchestrated rhythm. Aides carried messages, whispering in carefully measured tones. Guards walked corridors in pairs, exchanging glances that communicated caution without words. Charlotte observed not only actions but reactions. How a slight tilt of Camilla's head prompted a shift in posture among attendants. How a misplaced scroll caused tension in otherwise calm faces. Every micro-motion, every hesitation, was data. She collected it all silently, forming a mental map of influence and weakness. Lunch was a brief interruption, but Charlotte used even these moments to observe. The placement of plates, the choice of utensils, the order of serving, all symbolic in their precision. Even the smallest deviation could hint at underlying stress or favoritism, a human flaw in a system that demanded absolute equality in ceremony. Charlotte noted a misaligned napkin, and the way a servant's hand lingered too long near Camilla's glass. To most meaningless. To Charlotte, evidence of subtle cracks in the palace's armor. By mid-afternoon, Charlotte returned to the grand hall. Camilla was rehearsing the sequence of a minor ceremonial procession, repeating motions with relentless attention to precision. Yet, for the first time, Charlotte observed hesitation. A slight pause before salute, a hand brushing against the ceremonial scroll longer than expected. The veneer of perfection was faltering. Charlotte cataloged every nuance, mentally timing each action, noting the sequences where minor interventions might not be noticed. In a quiet corner, Charlotte discovered a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, misfiled among other documents. The letters contained instructions, amendments, and notes that suggested Camilla had been exercising authority beyond her sanctioned powers. Subtle overreach, written in ink that could be challenged, yet hidden behind layers of tradition. Charlotte read and reread the words, each one sharpening her understanding of the hierarchy, of protocol, and of the moral questions that would soon demand answers. Evening descended, and the palace dimmed into muted gold as torches were lit along the outer corridors. Charlotte moved carefully, retracing her morning observations, memorizing each guard's position, each aide behavior, each subtle lapse in ritual. She understood the palace was a network of control, yet also a network of vulnerability. She had become an unseen architect of awareness, quietly mapping the possibilities for challenge without disrupting the ceremonial flow. By nightfall, Charlotte's strategy was clear. Observation, patience, and understanding had revealed cracks invisible to those blinded by the insistence on perfect ritual. She had seen the subtle human flaws Camilla had tried to mask, the minor lapses in protocol that could not be entirely controlled, and the silent signs of dissent among staff who had long endured strictness in silence. Charlotte had begun to understand that power was not merely command, but perception. And in those perceptions, she found the leverage she would need for the days to come. As she tucked the misfiled letters into a private compartment, Charlotte sensed the first real vulnerability in Camilla's authority, a procedural misstep that could, if observed carefully, unravel the illusion of absolute control. The palace corridors were quiet, but the air hummed with anticipation. Charlotte had spent days cataloging every nuance of Camilla's control, every minor lapse in routine, every hesitation in protocol. The meticulous observations were no longer enough. Action was required. The day of the midday ceremony approached, its significance immense, its ritual precision an opportunity Charlotte could not ignore. Every corridor, every guard, every aid had been mapped in her mind, and the slightest misstep, carefully executed, could signal the first challenge to centuries of unquestioned authority. Camilla moved to the ceremonial hall as always, commanding with every gesture, every measured word. Her robes fell in perfect folds. Her eyes scanned every corner for imperfection. The guards' footsteps echoed in precise rhythm. The aides murmured orders in low, disciplined voices. To anyone watching, the palace was a flawless machine, a testament to centuries of rigid hierarchy. But Charlotte had discovered the seams, minor, almost imperceptible vulnerabilities that could be tested without disrupting the outward flow of ceremony. The moment arrived. A simple gesture, a slight deviation from the prescribed protocol, was all that was needed. Charlotte stepped forward at the precise moment, her movement measured, deliberate. She bypassed a minor ceremonial command, one that tradition dictated must be observed exactly, and performed it differently, subtly, yet visibly. The room froze. Aides exchanged uneasy glances. Guards hesitated mid-step. Camilla's gaze flickered, a brief, imperceptible crack in the armor of absolute control. For a heartbeat, the palace held its breath. Charlotte's defiance was not loud, not violent. It was calculated, deliberate, and symbolic. A small act, yet the reaction provoked revealed a fragile balance of authority. Whispers rippled through the aides. Tension tightened the corridors, and Charlotte felt the weight of observation pressing on her. She had become not merely a participant in ceremony, but a disruptor, a subtle force testing the limits of obedience. Camilla's eyes, sharp and commanding, settled on Charlotte. The faintest flicker of recognition crossed her expression, though outwardly she remained composed. Every micromotion was scrutinized. The tilt of her head, the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. Charlotte saw it all, cataloged it, and understood that authority could be challenged not through force, but precision and timing. The emotional midpoint arrived as Charlotte realized she was not alone. In the subtle shifts of glances and the slight hesitations of aides, she noticed a quiet alliance forming. Staff who had long endured strict control began to reveal small signs of sympathy, admiration even. Their loyalty to tradition remained, but respect for courage was quietly surfacing. Charlotte's act had not only challenged Camilla, it had illuminated the desires and frustrations of those who served silently. Camilla, sensing control slipping, increased the intensity of her oversight. Commands were sharper, movements more precise, eyes scanning for errors in others and signs of further defiance in Charlotte. The tension thickened. Every gesture carried weight. Every motion became a test. Charlotte's heart raced, but her face remained calm. Her mind focused on observation, strategy, and timing. This was no longer a rehearsal of ceremony. It was a battle of perception, a confrontation fought without swords or raised voices, yet every bit as consequential. Dialogue between aides grew tense but restrained. A whispered correction here, a subtle glance there. Charlotte responded without words, letting her presence and measured actions convey a defiance that required no sound. The silence of the palace became her ally, amplifying the significance of small gestures and subtle breaches in routine. Each movement, each glance, each pause communicated volumes, and Charlotte was fluent in the silent language of power. The climax approached as Charlotte executed a carefully timed gesture, one that directly challenged Camilla's authority in a ceremonial act. The room froze again. The ripple of tension was palpable. A ceremonial sword, held at the correct angle for centuries, was slightly misaligned. An error no aide dared commit, yet occurred in the exact moment Charlotte had predicted. The room held a collective breath, eyes darting between Charlotte and Camilla. A single look, charged with meaning, became the stage for a moral confrontation. Charlotte felt the weight of centuries of protocol pressing on her. The palace, built on discipline, tradition, and loyalty, now bore witness to the first act of defiance executed not recklessly, but with careful calculation. In that moment, she understood the true nature of power. Not the ability to command blindly, but the ability to influence perception, to reveal the cracks in authority, to awaken courage in others. Camilla, outwardly composed, retreated inwardly, recalculating. She sensed the shifting loyalty, the emerging respect for Charlotte among aides and guards alike. Her authority, once absolute, now trembled subtly under the weight of observation and silent alliance. Every ritualistic movement she performed was now shadowed by the awareness that perfection could be challenged, that obedience could be questioned, that control was not immutable. The palace, in that silent standoff, became a crucible. Charlotte's deliberate defiance, tempered by patience and precision, had tested the boundaries of tradition. Every glance, every micro-movement, every hesitant step by the staff carried a message. Authority is vulnerable, even in the grandest halls, and courage, when exercised with care, inspires alignment and recognition among those bound by discipline. By evening, the echoes of the midday ceremony lingered in the corridors. Charlotte retreated to a quiet alcove, cataloging reactions, analyzing responses, and planning the next stage. She had executed the first strike, tested the limits of obedience, and observed the emergence of allies who respected her insight and courage. The palace, grand and imposing, had revealed its vulnerabilities, and Charlotte had positioned herself not as a rebel without cause, but as an orchestrator of quiet transformation. In the shadows of the grand hall, Charlotte overheard a conversation, subtle, confidential, revealing alliances and secrets that could upend the hierarchy entirely. The stage was set for confrontation, and the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The echo of the midday ceremony still lingered in the corridors, a ghost of order disturbed. Charlotte retreated to the shadows, her mind replaying every subtle movement, every hesitant glance from aides and guards alike. She had struck first, tested authority, and now the consequences began to ripple through the palace like invisible currents beneath the marble floors. Every step she took was measured, for in a world where obedience was sacred, even silence could betray intent. Camilla, isolated in her study, examined the aftermath with meticulous precision. Scrolls were unrolled, ceremonial logs scrutinized, and letters reread for the slightest indication of deviation. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned every detail, every imperfection. Even a minor misalignment of a parchment could signal negligence, and in her mind, negligence was unacceptable. Yet she found herself troubled not by open rebellion, but by subtle defiance, the kind that whispered through glances, gestures, and minor lapses in protocol. The palace, built on centuries of rigid order, suddenly seemed fragile. Charlotte moved silently through lesser-used corridors, cataloging the positions of guards, the timing of their patrols, and the flow of aides carrying messages. She observed the placement of documents, noting which ones were frequently accessed and which were locked away. Every creak in a floorboard, every faint shuffle of papers became data, evidence of the cracks in the palace's rigid exterior. Her careful study revealed alliances she had not anticipated, guards and aides who quietly admired her courage, or resented Camilla's tightening grip. They remained silent, but their loyalty was no longer unquestioned. The emotional weight of defiance pressed on Charlotte. Every choice carried consequences, and the palace seemed alive with observation. Walls, tapestries, and doors did more than enclose space. They whispered, carried sound, and recorded behavior for those attuned to subtlety. Charlotte had learned to listen. Even a shadow across a corridor, a hesitant pause, or a misdirected glance could reveal truth. She cataloged it all. Camilla's paranoia intensified. She moved through rooms more frequently, double-checking ceremonial instruments, consulting aides more often than protocol dictated. Letters were examined twice, logs cross-referenced with careful scrutiny. Even guards felt the heightened tension, their disciplined movements now under increased pressure. What had once been routine now carried the weight of suspicion, a subtle fear of unseen observation. Charlotte watched from the periphery, noting every detail, every lapse in attention that Camilla's vigilance revealed. In one dimly lit corridor, Charlotte discovered a hidden room, long forgotten, where ceremonial documents were archived. She noted letters tucked behind older scrolls, logs marked with faint pencil corrections, small oversteps in authority that could have remained hidden for decades. The room was a repository not just of records, but of insight, a mirror into the decision-making and occasional overreach of Camilla's control. Charlotte traced each document carefully, memorizing sequences and notations, understanding the vulnerabilities of those who wielded power with excessive rigidity. The palace staff responded quietly to the tension. Conversations became measured, glances more deliberate, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. Charlotte observed hesitation in movement and speech, the subtle ways loyalty and fear intertwined. She cataloged these behaviors as evidence, understanding that influence could be gained not through confrontation alone, but through careful perception of human weakness and the hidden desires of those who served. Nightfall brought dim torches along corridors and an oppressive stillness. Charlotte reflected on the cost of her actions, the subtle rebellion, the moral question of challenging centuries of tradition, the risk of exposure. Every corridor seemed to hold secrets, every door a potential threat, every whisper a message. The palace was no longer a place of predictable order. It had become a web of observation, suspicion, and moral ambiguity. Camilla's increasing vigilance created new opportunities. In her obsession with minor errors, she overlooked the patterns of behavior forming around Charlotte. A misfiled letter, a delayed response, a small hesitation. Each became an unintentional signal. Charlotte saw the advantage in timing, patience, and the careful orchestration of observation. Authority, she realized, was not unassailable. It was conditional, fragile, and human. By the end of the night, Charlotte had traced a flow of influence and discovered proof that her subtle defiance was not only justified, but strategically sound. The walls had ears, the palace was alive with observation, and her patience had allowed her to see what others could not. Authority could be tested, loyalty could shift, and calculated courage could illuminate the cracks in the system. In the dim light of the hidden archives, Charlotte uncovered undeniable proof that her defiance was justified, a discovery that would set the stage for a confrontation Camilla could not ignore. The morning of the ceremony arrived with muted sunlight spilling over the palace gates, gilding arches and marble floors in a soft, deliberate glow. Charlotte stood at the edge of the hall, her posture measured, her breathing steady. The culmination of weeks of observation, calculation, and subtle defiance rested on this moment. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, aware of a shift taking shape within its walls. Every eye, every gesture, every movement in the corridors carried weight. Anticipation hung like a taut string, ready to vibrate at the slightest provocation. Camilla moved through the hall with the precision of a practiced sovereign, robes flowing, scrolls perfectly aligned, candles casting flawless lines of light across polished stone. Yet there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a faint hesitation in her step, imperceptible to most but glaring to Charlotte. The palace staff exchanged quiet, knowing glances. They had observed the quiet defiance, understood the courage, and now waited for the resolution that had been long overdue. Charlotte's moment came not with shout, nor with dramatic gesture, but with the elegance of calculated audacity. She stepped into the ceremonial sequence at the precise instant, performing her duty differently, correct in substance but subtly divergent in execution. A ripple passed through the aides. Guards paused, uncertain. Camilla's gaze sharpened, a flicker of incredulity betraying the illusion of control. Every motion Charlotte made was deliberate, a language of power spoken silently but unmistakably. The emotional weight of the palace shifted. Staff who had long endured Camilla's strict dominance began to reveal quiet approval, small nods of respect and restrained smiles. Loyalty, once absolute to authority alone, now recognized courage. Charlotte's defiance was no longer an isolated act. It had become a statement that could not be ignored. The room held its collective breath, the delicate balance of tradition and rebellion poised on a knife's edge. Dialogue became unnecessary. Every glance, every micromotion, every carefully timed gesture carried meaning. Charlotte moved through the ritual with precision, her every step demonstrating that authority could be exercised without fear, that tradition could coexist with discernment and moral judgment. Camilla's initial shock hardened into recalibration. Commands were sharper, eyes sharper, but the subtle realization had settled. Control was no longer unilateral. The climax arrived when Charlotte executed a symbolic gesture that directly challenged Camilla's supremacy in the ceremony. It was simple, elegant, unassuming, yet undeniable. A ceremonial element, perfectly timed, disrupted the expected pattern. The hall froze. Guards adjusted stance. Aides exchanged urgent, silent glances. Camilla's composure faltered for the briefest moment, a pause that echoed louder than any words. Charlotte's defiance was complete, yet dignified. Authority had been challenged, yet order remained intact. In the stunned silence, Charlotte felt the weight of centuries of tradition, yet she bore it without faltering. She had achieved what few could. She had revealed a vulnerability, inspired silent allegiance, and asserted influence without chaos. The palace itself seemed to shift, walls echoing not just with discipline, but with the resonance of courage exercised thoughtfully. History, protocol, and personal integrity intersected in this moment. A quiet revolution conducted with precision and restraint. Camilla, caught off guard, recalculated her approach. Her dominance remained, but tempered. She recognized with reluctant clarity that authority demanded more than adherence to ritual. It required discernment, empathy, and respect. The aides breathed relief. Guards showed subtle acknowledgement, and the palace absorbed the change without outward disorder. Charlotte's measured grace had altered the dynamics of loyalty, transforming perception into quiet empowerment. As the ceremony concluded, Charlotte retreated to the shadows once reserved for observation, now a place of reflection. The reversal of power was not explosive, but inevitable, realized through patience, insight, and courage exercised at the right moment. The palace, a living monument of tradition, had accepted her influence, the delicate balance between obedience and moral authority restored. As calm returned to palace, Charlotte's mind traced the lessons of strategy, patience, and courage, aware that even in restored order, the true measure of authority lay in the careful exercise of moral power. The palace was quiet now, the echoes of ceremony replaced by a gentle, contemplative stillness. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating gilded arches, polished floors, and the countless objects that bore witness to centuries of tradition. Every tapestry, every ceremonial sword, every scroll seemed to breathe with the weight of history. Charlotte walked these halls slowly, deliberately, her footsteps measured, in no rush to disturb the calm she had earned. The air was softer now, the tension dissolved, leaving only the awareness of responsibility. She paused in the grand hall, where weeks earlier she had executed the first strike that would alter the palace's balance of power. The memory was vivid. The hesitant glances of aides, the pause in guard steps, Camilla's fleeting flicker of uncertainty. Charlotte had learned that authority was not a weapon to wield recklessly, but a weight to bear thoughtfully. The lessons were clear. Patience, observation, and moral courage carried more power than any ritual, any decree or ceremonial mandate. Camilla had retreated to her private chambers, subdued but unbroken, her composure restored yet tempered with humility. Charlotte observed from afar, recognizing the humanity that lay behind even the most rigid authority. In her quiet reflection, she understood that power exercised without empathy could command obedience, but it was respect and insight that cultivated true loyalty. The palace, a monument to structure and hierarchy, had become a canvas on which human integrity could be demonstrated. Charlotte's gaze drifted to the aides and guards moving through the corridors. Their expressions, once rigid with protocol, now reflected subtle acknowledgement, measured approval, and quiet relief. Authority, she realized, was a living, breathing interaction, an exchange between tradition and discernment, between order and justice. Her journey had not been one of brute defiance, but of careful engagement with the moral architecture of her world. The artifact of history surrounded her, swords polished to perfection, tapestries depicting battles and alliances, scrolls detailing ceremonies performed over centuries. They were silent reminders of the weight of legacy, of the responsibility she now held. Charlotte felt the subtle hum of influence in her hands, the delicate balance between enforcing tradition and embracing change. She had not destroyed the palace's order. She had refined it, harmonized it with the human truths that lay hidden beneath rigid expectation. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the marble, Charlotte reflected on the lessons learned. Patience was power. Observation was strategy. Courage, measured and morally aligned, could transform not just a single act but an entire institution. The palace was no longer merely a structure of stone and ceremony. It was a living testament to the harmony between tradition and insight. In the quiet moments before nightfall, Charlotte allowed herself a final glance at the mislaid documents, the subtle imperfections, and the human errors she had cataloged. They were no longer threats. They were reminders. Reminders that authority, no matter how meticulously constructed, remained human, fallible, and capable of evolution when guided by patience, courage, and reflection. The palace itself seemed to breathe with her understanding, its walls echoing not just with history, but with the promise of measured change. Charlotte had embraced her role, not as a rebel, but as a steward of balance, a guardian of both tradition and morality. She understood now that the true measure of leadership lay not in domination, but in careful, principled guidance, in listening as much as commanding, in observing as much as acting. In the silent halls of power, Charlotte considered the enduring question: who truly commands loyalty, the unwavering weight of tradition, or the courage to exercise it wisely? And as shadows deepened, the palace held its answer, patient and enduring, awaiting the next chapter of history to unfold.